Good morning and welcome to West Texas A&M University. Do you people hear me okay? Last rows? Is it okay? All right. This is our 13th International Business Seminar. We have started this series in 1993, and over these years, we have invited lots of speakers from Washington, D.C., Houston, Dallas, but today we have three distinguished speakers. First of all, my name is Syed Tariq Anwar. If you don't know me, I teach marketing and international business links, international business. Our first speaker is Dr. Julian Gaspar. And by the way, on the back of this handout, you have all the bios because we do not want to spend too much time on the bios. You can read it. Dr. Gaspar is coming from Texas A&M University College Station. He arrived yesterday at 10:45 p.m. And then Dr. Dale Duhan, he's Associate Director of International Business Program, our neighbor Texas Tech University in Lubbock. And then we have, of course, Mr. John Marmaduke, President, Chief Executive Officer, and Chairman, Hastings Entertainment. And so these are our speakers, but few things about the seminar. First of all, if you get a parking ticket, please let me know after the seminar. I'll take care of that, since there is a parking problem here. If you go to the second page of this handout, I have listed some of the books and a couple of studies I did on globalization. And interestingly, it is very interesting that in the last 3 years only, more than 1,000 books were published only on the topic of globalization. So you can see it's a multidisciplinary. Almost every discipline is trying to discuss this area because it does have lots of impact. So before I invite Mr. Gaspar, Dr. Gaspar, I just want to make a comment about John Marmaduke. He's always a good supporter, WT's friend. Hastings Electronic Learning Lab, it was funded by his company, so we thank him for that. But yesterday, I was talking to Bob Linderman, who is in the audience. He made a very interesting comment about John because he told me that he went to Amarillo High School with John in 1966, and he said, and I quote, "Intellectuals among the intellectuals." In those days also, Mr. Marmaduke, he was one of the intellectuals. So let's give a warm welcome to our speakers.
Howdy. No response here. College Station, if you say howdy, everybody will yell back, howdy. Okay. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here from College Station. And this is my second visit to Canada. And it's really great to be here where the world is really flat to talk about globalization. And with that, what I'd like to do is to give you an overview, more a macroeconomic overview of what globalization is and where we are going. With that, I'll start. We have, I think, 15 minutes, and I have about 8 slides. Hopefully, I'll be done on time. Okay. First is, what is globalization? Okay. And if you really think about globalization, you can break it down. Yeah. No. It's missing, I think. The second page is missing. I think maybe we got the wrong one there. Anyway. No, it's not quite the same. Well, it's a different globalization, but I think you have the handout there. Okay. If you pick the handout, I think you have the right one there. The term actually describes what's going on in globalization is the rapid and free movement of goods, services, labor, all these things which have been really increasing across international borders. So that's the first thing in terms of globalization. And where does that lead us to? Well, it leads to faster integration of the economies. So what we are seeing now in terms of globalization is greater integration as well as interdependence of nations. Okay. So that's what we mean by globalization. Then it leads us to the second question: what are the catalysts? What are the driving forces of globalization? What is making this happen? If you ask people like Tom Friedman and others, globalization really started way back in 1498 when Vasco da Gama from Portugal crossed over the oceans to come to India in search of spices and trade. But the more recent globalization actually started in 1947 with the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions and institutions like the World Bank, the GATT, and WTO. And what has happened is trade liberalization, that is reduction of tariffs, quotas, and things like that have come into effect. And again, there are two major issues or two major catalysts of globalization. First is economic liberalization, that is countries that have been able to reform their economies and going towards more open market systems, okay, that is free market, open trade, and not only in goods but also in services. That's why we see a lot of discussion about outsourcing, for example. The second major impetus for globalization is technology. You'll find that each time you have a revolution, like the technology revolution, you find changes in technology, and more so in this case is the changes in information technology. That is the role of the internet, ERP systems, that is the enterprise resource planning systems, supply chain, developments in these that have really accelerated the globalization process. So that's why the world is becoming more and more intertwined. The third topic is, how does globalization impact business? That is very important. We want to know, how does this really impact business? The shift has occurred in terms of production of goods as well as services. That's where you see the real change in globalization. And why is that happening? Well, there are three reasons. The first is the self-interest of shareholders. Shareholders want to maximize wealth, so companies want to do that. CEO compensation, again, CEOs are compensated based on how they perform or how their companies perform. So they want to look at the whole world as their playing field to minimize cost and maximize revenues and profits. And so that is leading to changes in business practices. Second is the change of mix, what companies produce. Things are changing. So you find companies are outsourcing more, producing certain products or components at home, and the remainder being sourced from outside. So that again is based on cost of capital. Those of you who are in finance, depends upon the cost of capital at home and labor cost. So whatever is cost effective, companies look at it from the global perspective to try to set up operations. So they produce certain components at home, something else overseas. So that's what they try to do. And so the last item in terms of the impact on business is the impact on competition. So what globalization is leading to is to increase competition. So competition is becoming really stiff, and you also see specialization with competition. So increasingly companies will focus in certain areas where they really have a competitive advantage and produce other goods and services overseas. And that leads to productivity increases. That's why if you look at the United States, we have productivity increase averaging about 3% a year. Part of the reason is we try to keep some of the goods and service manufacturing right at home, where we really have a competitive advantage, and move offshore things, IT services and production, like to India and China. Okay? And that also sparks innovation. So how does globalization impact countries? Okay, so how does it impact companies? The next countries. So countries which transform themselves, that is, move towards free markets, open systems, private property, things like that, those are the countries which are going to do well in the future. And so countries that follow pragmatic economic policies, that is both monetary and fiscal policy. For example, we have relatively good monetary policies here in the United States, but fiscal policy needs some work, okay? and that is reflected by the fact that we have huge deficits in the fiscal account. So we have fiscal deficit as well as current account deficit, twin deficits, which is going to be one of the big challenges that the United States will have to face over the next decade. And the whole issue of privatization, enforcing the rule of law. Countries that do this, who have a transparent system, will be the ones that are going to do well in this globalized economy. Okay? And so I've been talking about all the advantages or all the positive impacts of globalization. But yet you see whenever the World Bank, IMF meetings, which are held annually, you'll see a lot of protests. Okay? People are protesting globalization. Why is that? Much of this is due to the impact on jobs, okay? Because as I mentioned earlier, as companies try to maximize earnings, they move certain production overseas. So certain jobs are lost, some companies will fade away while new companies come in. So this process of transition from, because of globalization, is going to hurt some and some are going to gain. So the losers are the ones who are going to suffer. And so these are the people who are protesting. So what needs to be done is we need to have a system of retraining workers so that they can adjust to the new globalized or knowledge-based economy. And the other concern that people have, those who protest, is the impact on the environment. Okay? Some of these emerging market economies are growing pretty rapidly, like China, India, Brazil, and to an extent even Russia. So this is having an impact on the environment, physical environment. And so people are concerned that the environment is being polluted. And the other issue is also because of globalization, you will see the gap between the rich and the poor is widening, and that is a concern for people who are concerned about development. Okay? So where is globalization leading us? Or having said all this, where is it taking us? So what is happening is the pace of integration, the integration of countries together, and interdependence of countries is increasing, and is increasing at a very rapid rate. And you find countries are emerging countries like China, India, Brazil, and Russia in particular. They're becoming world-class competitors, okay? That really indicates how these countries are integrating into the global economy. So that's the second important thing one should realize. The third issue, when you look at it from a global perspective, is the distinction between the developed economies, that is, say, the US, Japan, Europe, the distinction between these countries and the emerging economies, that is China, India, Russia, Brazil. The distinction is narrowing, okay? So that is, again, because of greater integration and competition. And so that's something which we need to be aware of. And the last item is, of course, in terms of production. You'll find that companies are becoming global in nature. A good case in point, an American company would be IBM, which is doing quite a bit of its operations overseas. Just yesterday's Financial Times, if you read, you're talking about Citibank, Citicorp, Citigroup. 45% of the earnings currently come from abroad. Now Chuck Prince, the CEO, wants to raise it to 60% because he feels that the opportunities in mature economies like the United States and Europe is decreasing because these countries are going to grow slowly, and the real profit is going to be more in the emerging economies. So you see the production and markets going global. And the last, unfortunately, we don't have the table there, but I think you have it on your handout. The most interesting thing there to see what the situation is going to be like in 2020. I have in my chart there the GDP, the purchasing power parity, GDP based on purchasing power parity, which is a true reflection of the strength of these countries and the size of these economies. And so if you look at the ranking, the world's largest economy based on PPP is the United States, currently. United States followed by China, Japan, then India and Germany. By 2020, the world's largest economy is going to be China, followed by United States, then India and Japan. So you can see that the 21st century is going to be Asia's century, just as 20th century was the American century and the 19th century was the British century. So you're going to really see a sea change. And so the opportunities and things like that as far as globalization is concerned is changing, the dynamics are changing, okay? So I'm sorry we didn't get the right PowerPoint on, but you have the handout, so I'll leave it at that because I think it's my time is up. And if you have any questions, I think during the Q&A session we'll do that. Okay, thank you.
Try also, as Julian did. Howdy.
Howdy.
That's better. Does that sound more like what you had at A&M? Yeah. I'd like to follow, first of all, with a couple of comments, building on some things that Julian mentioned about globalization. We're seeing also, if you look at that reading list that you've got there, there's a book called The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. He has a couple of others that he's written that are very interesting. His major thesis that he's making there is that it's becoming easier and easier nowadays for smaller businesses to go global, go international. It used to be something that required a lot of investment in infrastructure, and therefore it was kind of the domain of many larger companies or very highly specialized companies. So it's an interesting thing. I might also suggest that there's another book that would be very interesting for people in this region that you might add to your list. It's called the Global Travels of a T-Shirt. Can't remember the author's name. She's at Georgetown University. And she starts with a bale of cotton that's produced in West Texas and follows it all the way through until the products are manufactured. It goes across 3 continents. It goes through many different countries. It follows the whole value chain all the way through until the T-shirts are finally, you know, most of us, of course, don't wear out our clothing. We throw our clothing away or give it away to some charity before it's worn out. And so she followed it even after she had taken this particular T-shirt and given it to, I guess it was Goodwill or something like this. And there's a market for all these kinds of things. And it ends up in Africa, and it ends up in some interesting kinds of markets and bazaars there. And it's a fascinating story about how interconnected the farms out here are to the markets in the whole world. It's really quite an interesting thing. I'm actually considering using that as a theme for my international graduate course next fall. Because of the nature of this sort of value chain, moves all over the world and crosses borders all the time, and the things that it faces. When I started considering what I should talk about here today in a very short time, I decided, well, Dale, you're a marketing professor, so maybe you should talk about sort of the macro view of global markets. And so I thought I would start there by looking at some fundamental changes that are occurring in markets, and they come in a variety of types. We'll talk mostly today about some demographic changes that have huge impact on markets that are available for all kinds of businesses, small and large. But first of all, I want you to consider a couple of interesting, I guess you might call them factoids, that come along with life in the last in the last 50 or 60 years. Shortly after World War II, the United States economy represented about half of the world's GDP. U.S. economy is down to somewhere between a quarter and a third of world GDP now, depending on how you measure things with purchasing power parity and some of those adjustments, and quickly running on down toward 20%. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, sometimes when you say things like that, people go, oh my gosh, you know, we're falling behind and so forth. But no, not really. It's been an explicit policy and efforts that U.S. Has made for many years to try to help build up other economies around the world, to try to promote globalization and integration. In fact, there is a school of thought that runs along the lines that if we are interdependent with one another economically, we're much more likely to live in peace, you know? Because you want the people who buy your products to do well, so they'll buy more, and you want the folks that from whom you're buying and they owe you money to be able to pay, and I'm sorry, that are buying from you and to be able to pay. And I think it was all summed up once by a colleague of mine at Michigan State one time who said that it just doesn't make any sense to drop bombs on your accounts receivable. So therefore, as we integrate the economies of the world, we are actually indirectly, maybe even directly, promoting much more cooperation and in this world of nuclear weapons and terrorism and so forth. We are perhaps helping to promote a longer-term peace in the world. So there's a very macro kind of a perspective that you can take in looking at globalization and saying that this is something that's probably good for everybody. Our markets, we here in the United States, the markets to whom we sell things are getting better and stronger and healthier. And of course, hopefully, this will cause us all to prosper and get along better. I'm not sure how we should do this. I've got a lot of slides, and so it's going to be a pretty active thing for you. Since I'm a marketing professor, as I mentioned, I wanted to start with markets. And so I want to use a very, very simplistic definition of what a market is. And there's lots of ways you can define markets. If you've had marketing courses, you've heard about market segmentation and all sorts of ways that we can divide things up. If you ever look at government data, you see the government data is usually sort of organized, or government data about the economy is often organized around the SIC codes, the Standard Industrial Classification System, which is very production-oriented. But we like to define markets as people with purchasing power, okay? And so as you look at markets, you want to look at where are the people, how many of them are there, what kind of purchasing power do they have, and of course some things that I won't talk about that are also important because we don't have time to go into all of this, are things such as do they have the support infrastructure to be able to purchase your products and use them. Even if they have the money to buy them, they may not be able to support them. And so this, I've got quite a few slides, so we'll move through here pretty fast. First I want to talk about the people side of it, and just talk about a few long-term trends. Now, how many of you are aware of the fact that the United States is rapidly approaching a milestone that has become a kind of a marketing issue for a few companies like Gerber and some others? You know what's going on? Population, well, we're getting older, but
Third largest country in the world.
Third largest country in the world, but there's a milestone that's rolling around here real soon. 300 million, that's correct. I got on the U.S. Census Bureau's website a couple of days ago and looked at what they call the population clock, right? And they have a clock, which is sort of minute by minute, and they really update this thing every few minutes. And I calculated that sometime on Monday, this coming Monday, sometime midday this coming Monday, is when the 300 million American will either arrive or be born. It's mostly births, but there's also, of course, immigration that's occurring. So that's been in the news a lot lately. But one other thing that was in the news not long ago that I think is also quite important, and we'll get around to talking about that. Go ahead and into the next one. But let's talk about population first, and we'll come back to the other issue. First of all, world population has been growing, as I'm sure you're all aware. There's been a lot in the news about that. This is just a simple chart of going back, 12,000 years, and estimates of not quite sure when it all started, right? So some researchers here have come up with this estimate here, but you see the effects of what's going on. Now, in recent decades, of course, we've also been looking at much better data, but you see the nature of the increase of growth of population in the world. It's huge and growing very rapidly. And there are lots of folks who are very concerned about this sort of thing, with using up resources and possibly polluting the world, all sorts of things that are happening with that. So why this increase has occurred? Well, let's take a look at a couple of very quick things, because there are lots of issues, and we're going to just shorten this down. Largely, this is a result of declining mortality rates, especially infant mortality rates, and also, which is related but somewhat different, lengthening life expectancies. And so there are many more people who are surviving, being born, and going through those first very fragile years of childhood, and there are many more people who, after they've gotten through that, are living a longer time. Life expectancies in many countries have more than doubled in the last couple of centuries, and that has quite an impact on the populations. Yeah. Infant mortality rates is just an example, for instance, of some data from 81 to 97, looking at world infant mortality rates have been coming down really dramatically. Next one. And life expectancies, these are a variety of different forecasts that have been done, which are updated as you see some of these lines start at different points in time. But generally, the story is the same either way, no matter what kind of forecasting tool is used. Okay, however, lots of the demographers have been pointing out lately that this is maybe coming to an end. That we're actually beginning to approach the end of that process, which I suppose in some respects is perhaps good news, although it can have some pretty significant negative economic impacts. If any of you have ever visited, as I'm sure many of you have, smaller towns in the Great Plains area where there used to be, say, 2,000 or 3,000 people, and now there are 200 or 300 people. You see some of the economic problems that these communities have. My mother grew up in a town that's like that, and I was back there this past summer looking at the place, and I don't know, there's some amazing kinds of things that happen in some of these circumstances. You know, real estate values get to be really bizarre. Beautiful, great, big Victorian houses. It must be 3,000 or 4,000 square feet that are for sale for $20,000. You know, in good shape and things like that. But of course, this is because of the decline in population in those areas. So there's some potential negative effects. But let's go on. This is a quote that I took out of Nature magazine by some demographers who've been looking at this, and they're arguing here that there's an 85% chance that the world's population will stop growing before the end of this century. Some forecasts put it actually close to the middle of the century. 60% probably the world's population will not exceed 10 billion. Now, we are at 6.5 billion right now on the planet approximately. And at the rate of growth that you saw on one of those previous charts, it's going up quite rapidly. But they're arguing that it would not exceed that, and that there's actually, they say, a 15% probability that the world's population will begin to decline by the end of the century. And that gets to that issue in terms of some of the negative impact it might have. And of course, this is not something which occurs uniformly. It can happen, and as is happening, in very differently in different parts of the world. Okay, here's a brief view of the United Nations long-range projections. The UN puts out projections of world population every 10 years. And the most recent one was the first one that they put out, in which their most likely scenario, the median variant that you see here, which is their most likely scenario, is actually showing that world population will flatten out around the middle of the century and then begin to decline. So, you know, we'll see how that happens, whether that happens or not. Of course, forecasts are often just that. You know how forecasting can work sometimes. Next one. I'm not sure what the next one is. Oh yeah, here's a different model. This is a model that fits existing data and is actually forecasting a fairly significant decline. A little bit different model. Forecasters use different kinds of models. This is why it's always a good idea to have a multitude of forecasts, and perhaps require each of those forecasts to look at the most likely, the low likely, and the high likely scenarios that you may have. Okay. Okay, now, the decline in many respects has already started. This is the growth rate that we've been seeing in the last 50 or so years. And you see that the rate of growth of population around the world has been declining pretty steadily, and the forecasts are for it to continue on out. You see this numbers out to 2050. Next one. This is pretty much the same information, only this is expressed in terms of numbers of people that are being added to the world population each decade or each year. Okay, why is this occurring? Well, there's a number of things, and again, we're not going to go into all the different kinds of reasons because we don't have a lot of time. But first of all, we have declining birth rates. Okay, there is something called the birth dearth, right? And another topic, I think, on which there may be 1,000 books that have been published are all about the fact that in many countries around the world, you're finding that people are just not having enough children to replace the population which is there. There are a number of European countries right now that are not having enough children to replace themselves and keep themselves going. Let's go to the next one. I may not get through though. All right, birth rates and death rates. So you see both of them are coming down, so there's an issue of a dynamic between the two that actually results in this decline that we may see at the end of the century, toward the middle of the century. Okay, how do these changes interact with one another? And again, there are many other kinds of things. Well, demographers also give us an interesting kind of a theory that they've developed involving the stages of what we call demographic transition. First stage you see up here is one that most countries have begun to move out of, and that is in which you have very high birth rates and very high death rates, and that is a stability mechanism that keeps population levels low. Generally what we have found around the world is that death rates decline much earlier in time as we look at the country's history than birth rates do. Death rates decline for a variety of good reasons, mostly having to do with sanitation and better nutrition and medical technologies and things of this kind. In the third stage, birth rates begin to come down, and this is where we are in many parts of the world right now, in which birth rates and death rates are both coming down, but I guess But again, birth rates are often still above that. And then in some countries, as I mentioned, some European countries now, we're at a point where they're in stage 4 already, in which they're down to low levels of birth rates, low levels of death rates in terms of expectancy from birth, and so their populations are stable or perhaps declining. Okay, again, this is a similar kind of an idea here. This is in the presentation, which you look at the total population, and in this case, looking at the stages as we're looking through here, births and deaths, and what happens with this gap in between the two. Now, these changes are not uniform around the world, as I mentioned before. They are different in different places. You see Europe, as I mentioned already, North America, with much lower rates of both. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America have much bigger gaps and much slower changes in what's occurring. Okay. And let's skip this one because I'm getting short on time. Let's skip that one. Why are birth rates declining? And I'll try to wrap this up very quickly. Largely it's because of the urbanization of the world population. Now this is the other issue that I was wanting to relate to in terms of the 300 million that the milestone that the U.S. is passing. Well, the world is passing a milestone right about now too. There's differences in estimates of exactly what the date is. But we have now reached the point at which more than half of the world's population is urbanized. Right? First time in human history that we've had most of the world's population living either currently or very shortly living in urban areas. Now, urbanization of the population influences a variety of things. First and foremost, it influences the economy of children, right? What's the role of children in the economic unit called the family? And if you're in a subsistence farming kind of an environment, well, children are labor, okay? And they're an asset to the economic unit. When you move into an urban environment, very often what happens is the children move over to the liability side of the economic unit, right? Because they cost things and they don't necessarily produce what they cost. So there's an economic incentive to have fewer children and perhaps to have them later when you can afford them, because they are not a means of production, they are consumption unit in your and so we have other things that are related to that too. The age of marriage begins to get later, so the first birth begins to get later. Education levels go up, which is related to a number of things involving survival of children and so forth, and family planning, and infant mortality rates tend to go down. Okay. All right. So here's some projections, or here's some data and one projection regarding the percentage of the world population that are living in urbanized areas right now. And you see we've reached the point in 2000 where it's already 47% of the world population, and again, depending on the forecasters you're talking to or the forecast you're looking at, we may already have passed that point at this stage. Let's go ahead and skip through this. This was some examples of the city of Chicago growing from 14 people up to over 8 million in a metropolitan area in the space of less than 2 centuries. We have similar kinds of things occurring in many places around the world. Let's go. Okay, again, these changes are not uniform around the world. We have very big differences in what's occurring in rural, in terms of this is the total numbers for the world. Let's go to the next one, which is the differences. In less developed countries, we have, in terms of raw numbers of people, even though there is this shift into a larger percentage of the population in in urban areas, which tend to be people who have fewer children, we also have still a significant portion of the world's population in underdeveloped countries that are living in rural areas and still have these higher rates. Some differences here in terms of forecast, 1950, 1990, forecast out to 2030, but 1995, different regions of the world. Again, I'm short on time, so let's go ahead and go through this. Skip that one, skip that one. Major urban cities around the world as urbanization occurs. Some of you are probably familiar with many of these areas, but these are just some examples of the cities and how large they will be. And as you look at this, you see that we're dealing with a future in which the largest cities of the world are not going to be where they have been traditionally, that is in the developed parts of the world. Although, as these countries develop their economies and they are using fewer people as part of their agricultural sector, we'll probably find that the classification of what's developed and not developed gets adjusted too. Okay, one last couple of things we'll go through, and then I'll apologize for taking too much time. The other component I mentioned of markets is purchasing power. So just very briefly, let's go through these. Keep going. The U.S. share of world economy, as I mentioned, has gone down, has shrunk dramatically in the last 60 years. Go ahead. is it, we going back and forth? No. Keep on going down unless I got duplicates in there. Is it the last one? I must not have made the last change. I'm sorry. Both of us have a piece of a missing chunk out of our presentations. Well, purchasing power. There are differences, of course, in purchasing power, and what we're finding is that many areas of the world in which you have this urbanization occurring, in some areas it's occurring with a great deal of economic development going along with it. Not too long ago I saw a report that indicated that about half of the tall construction cranes in the world were all working in the Shanghai area. Enormous amount of construction, enormous amount of economic infrastructure being put in. And so you have some areas where purchasing power has gone up very dramatically. You have other areas of the world where urbanization is occurring, which will drive down some of the pressure on population, but we don't have the accompanying purchasing power that's coming along with it. I should stop here, since I'm way over time, and I apologize. Thank you very much for your attention.
Don't worry about running over because one of my few virtues is I read. And I've been reading a few things, and I want to put the rest of that to the rumor that I was an intellectual in high school. I don't think there is such a thing, but I did read a lot, and so it sort of makes sense that I'm selling books for a living. But I was just reading the Harvard Business Review last week, and this article, and I just had it blown up so everyone could see it. Basically, the title was Apocalypse Now, and the bottom line is predictions of globalization apocalypse are way off the mark. Most types of economic activity really don't cross borders. They're still largely concentrated domestically. So if there's anything to say about globalization, the best is yet to come. And if people are protesting now, just wait. And so I thought to sort of wrap up, when I was going to be on a panel with two academics, I talk a little bit about 50,000-foot view from what I'm reading about, and then some practical experience I had in Mexico working for Walmart when we first took over a discount chain and how globalization affected there. Number one, I just finished last night a new book by John Naisbitt. He wrote a book in 1980 that sort of revolutionized business books. It's called Megatrends. Remember that book? He accurately predicted so many things, it was sort of uncanny. He was the Notre Dame of popular press, so to speak. And his claim to fame, besides being a professor, he'd been at Harvard and a number of other schools, is he just took 50 papers a day and read them. Because, you know, the joke is that newspapers are the first draft of history. Okay. And what he was looking for, he didn't read the New York Times, by the way, or the LA Times. He read like the Seattle and the Denver and the Dallas paper, trying to get real regional trends. And when he would see the same trends in all of these markets, then he'd start putting together what became later megatrends. And he, for example, predicted that the television networks were going to decline in popularity and be a minority of the viewership, which everybody thought was goofy in 1980. They have 11% of the eyeballs now on television. So he wasn't too wrong, was he? Because he said this wasn't really hard to predict. I mean, remember Life magazine, Look magazine? They had all these popular magazines that everybody read. They're not even in business anymore. And so his new book is called Mind Trends. And he has a lot to say about globalization since he's been living in Europe for the last 6 years. His wife was a publisher in Vienna, and that's how he met her, and they lived there. He thinks that globalization not only is here to come, but it's going to be shared unequally. And he thinks a lot of the Asian countries are going to be powerhouses in this globalization, and he thinks Europe's going to get left behind. In fact, his chapter on Europe is titled Mutually Assured Decline. Because he says Europe is doing everything within their power to make sure that they're not going to be a player in the next 50 years. They've got so many laws and so many taxes and so many restrictions. He said Google could have never started in France, nor could Microsoft because of all the laws. When's the last French company that was started after World War II that's very successful? It's not the fashion business. With Luxottica for Italians. I mean, there are a few fashion things, but not too many. And how's Airbus doing these days? Yeah. Okay. Governments don't run businesses any better than they run the post office. So, in his point, the European model is not sustainable because Europe really believes this, that they have a great social model, and they do. I mean, the life of the worker in Europe is fabulous. They don't work very much. They work about 70% as many hours as we do. They have almost everything guaranteed by the government, from education to medicine to unemployment to retirement. But the problem is there's so few of them to support it, and they keep pushing off the problem a little bit like we are with Social Security, because politicians, they don't like to deal with the tough calls because they don't get any votes that way. And so he thinks in the future that the EU is going to be a declining power, and that Asia is going to be something to behold. For example, the tax rate in Europe is between 40 and 50% of GDP. China is 11%. Most of Asia is all under 20%. It's really funny, if you look at the countries that are growing the fastest, the tax rate has a fairly strong correlation. And I know from doing business even in Mexico, which you wouldn't think would have a lot of rules and regulations, think again. Working for Walmart back in the 90s, we took Walmart to purchase the largest discount chain in Mexico and wanted to make a major thrust there. It was a terrific market for them. But they had so many rules and regulations. I remember that we had a 150,000 foot store, the first Walmart Supercenter opening in Mexico City, and at the last minute, we couldn't open the store because some bureaucrat had determined that we didn't have enough trees in the parking lot. Now, there was a way to solve this. You know what this is? That's a dead Mexican politician. This is a live one. But Walmart didn't play that game, and they didn't know how to deal with somebody who wouldn't bribe them. So we ended up planting more trees, and we got the store open. And now that is the second most successful country for Walmart in the world, and it's doing very well. The stores are just doing terrific, and they've lowered the price of goods for everyone. So I'm going to go down from 50,000 feet a little bit down to my experience with Walmart and give you some on-the-ground experience. We took over the music and book, what's called rack jobbing, which is service distribution. We go in, we pull out the dated and non-saleable product, we put in the new releases, we re-merchandise it, we leave. It's a kind of skill that the discount store manager would not have. The music business is a pretty unique business, the book business is too. And so first to go in, the stores were being serviced by the local, regional record labels. And one store would have 12 different record labels coming and servicing them sometimes twice a week with vans. So the vans would be full of records. The guy would come in from Warner Brothers or Capitol or whatever and put in the Capitol records and pull out the old Capitol records and come twice a week. Sounds pretty great, huh? So figure that you had 50 discount stores, 150 discount stores, counting all of their formats in Mexico City at the time. You had about 10, 12 record labels twice a week. Imagine what the traffic, what that meant with all the vans going back and forth. Okay. I mean, you look in a dictionary and the definition of congested traffic is Mexico City. You know, the definition of pollution is Mexico City. And their supply chain was about a 1930s or 1940s American model. So Walmart wanted to bring in a new supply chain and bring in all the product all at once through their trucks, which were going to the stores anyway, and use modern, sophisticated computerization to determine what record should be in that store. Well, there was a hue and cry from the record labels like we were, I mean, we could have been communists and they would agree to this more warmly. They're coming in with this. And they balked and they refused, and they did this, they did that. Well, eventually, of course, Walmart prevailed and the business model was implemented. So here's what's happened with the business model. We lowered the cost of distribution by more than half. We lowered the cost of music and books to the consumer by a considerable amount. We improved the selection in each store because the record labels were all fighting for space and overstocking. Everybody won, except the guys driving the vans. Guess what the headline in the newspaper is? Hundreds of van drivers put out of work by Walmart. Okay? And so you got to remember when you're reading the paper about globalization, they don't give you the full picture. You know, Joseph Pulitzer said a century ago that you only sell newspapers by building people up and then tearing them down. You know, the media by its very nature is interested in ratings. And the only way you get ratings is by, I mean, 60 Minutes is not talking about nice things. They're trying to expose people, right? And that's why you watch it. And so just every time you see something about globalization, think about it a little bit. Who's the beneficiary? Because they don't put the beneficiaries on the front page. They don't sell newspapers. So that's my experience. And I would suggest all of you read World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. It's been mentioned by the other speakers. It's again, like all media stuff, it's overhyped, it's overgeneralized. But I think he's really on to a great idea. And if you happen to be, how many people in this room have too much time on their hands? Well, what I'd suggest, because I just spent 20 minutes driving down here from Amarillo, get the book on CD. It is a fabulous book on CD. I think it's a better audiobook than it is book. And you can turn some of that downtime that you're currently not utilizing properly effectively into something that's really meaningful. But Friedman will make you think. He's a very insightful surveyor of the global scene, and he travels a lot, speaks a lot. He'll make you think. And then the other book I would suggest is Mindsets by John Manson, which I just finished, which he talks about how things aren't really changing as fast as we think they are, and that most of the future is alive and present today. You just have to reassemble it. And by the way, he thinks that the next 30 years are going to be phenomenal areas for economic growth because we had this explosion of wonderful inventions in the last 20 years, the internet and all the things that came with it. And now we're going to get to amplify those into our daily lives. He said, sort of like the Renaissance, really, from a creative viewpoint, only lasted 40 years. But how many centuries did the Renaissance impact? And so we had a technology Renaissance with the microchip leading to the internet, leading to phones, leading to all this. And I think the final thing he says, and I think one of you alluded to it, and the thing we don't realize is one of the real drivers of the globalization is we had 1 billion people join it in the last 20 years. People from China, India, people from Eastern Europe, and people from Russia. And so there's going to be more competition. There are a lot more brains out there, a lot more people who want to study and get engineering degrees. And we're going to be challenged about it. And we're going to have to deal with it whether we like it or not. Thank you.
Okay, we have 15 minutes. Let's open this floor for your questions.
Oh, that's all I don't need. This is for the practitioner, Mr. Marmaduke. You know, as an academician, that's what I do here. I find there's a huge need to get reality into the classroom. I also find there's a huge need to talk about globalization, just like you did from 50,000 feet, but there's more important. Bring that down to what we're teaching our kids. The future that you are, all three of you are portraying is incredibly different than what we're teaching in the classrooms. How do we make that change to effectively provide a specialized workforce to meet this need? Because I don't see it. How do we do that? And I'm talking to you because you're in the field. Not that I don't respect the other two, but I'm different. In my career, I have found that while academics are great, they're not the real world. So I want to know from you how we should do that.
Well, it's not my area of expertise. I can tell you what Walmart did. They brought down a lot of Walmart associates who had language proficiency in Spanish. Of course, what we didn't realize at the time is if you speak Spanish here, you go down there, it's a caste system. They're going to make fun of your accent. I mean, you must sound like Barney Fife to them, I don't know, but when you speak Tex-Mex to them. And so everybody had to sort of go through a language refresher course like that. But I think the most important thing is just getting people to have experiences. You know, I think the thing that we don't realize that about American workers is we have initiative and we have social capital that the rest of the world lacks. We just take it for granted. You know? I mean, look, I'll give you a perfect example. I was talking to a multinational executive, and he said, you know, I was asking him, what's the difference in the Chinese and, you know, all this, and the rest of the world, workers in the rest of the world. But we all know they work hard. In fact, they work harder than we do in a lot of cases. But he said, let me give you an example. If I left my office and I'm gone for a week, when I get back, my secretary in the United States is taking care of everything. She's taken initiative. She's done things without being asked and all this kind of thing. I can guarantee you in China, they will not do one thing. And that's the difference in the American initiative. Now, they are slowly developing that initiative. And, but I don't think we realize how much of a cultural advantage we have over the rest of the world. And so if we can just couple that by not having a second-class science and engineering and kind of education, which is where we lag, I don't think anybody's going to take anything away from us. Now, let me say one other thing. Don't forget, there's more profit made in one hit movie than in all the DVD players sold. They're, you know, we talk about all these big numbers, but they're in the commodity business. It's a very low profit business. Steven Spielberg isn't in the commodity business, and he knows how to make big bucks.
I'd like to add something to that from the perspective of how do you get this into the experience of the students. Many of you in here today are students, right? How many of you have gone and studied abroad? Put your hands up. One?
What about international students?
Okay, international students are studying abroad, so put your hands up, right? Yeah, international students are studying abroad right now. That's what they're doing. Right? Now, this is one of the things that I think is really unfortunate about most American students is that we in the United States have a pretty low rate of student exposure to things international. And I think step number one is to simply get them a passport, get them on an airplane, get them out of the country, push them through culture shock, doing whatever you need to have them do. I'm a big promoter of study abroad programs, of internships abroad, and all these kinds of things, because for many people, that's a real life-changing experience. And they can relate that back to business activities, because of course business is involved in practically everything that goes on. So, and the second best thing that we can do, I think, is to do what you obviously have done here, is to try to get a lot of international students to come here, so that the experiences that our students have on campus are with people from other parts of the world. They can sit around and, you know, just shoot the bull with them and have coffee and whatever, and learn about their countries and these kinds of things. And very often, of course, friendships will strike up, or perhaps if it's not a friendship, they'll at least become aware of some other country, excuse me, and maybe begin to pay more attention to that place in the news, and get more of a sense that there's something else out there beyond the horizons besides the borders. So that's one thing I think in terms of experience of students on U.S. campuses that we should be promoting. The U.S. government has set goals of around 20% of students at American universities and colleges that they have experience abroad before they graduate. Those are kind of low. There's a number of private schools nowadays that are setting this as a requirement for graduation. Goal being 100% of students. If you're going to get a degree from our college, you will have a study abroad experience, or we're not giving you a degree. That's step one, you know. And I think that internationalizing people in that way is sometimes brutal, but very worthwhile.
Yes, I must say that this university has just set a standard of 20% of the undergraduate students graduating with a study abroad, and we are organizing exchange programs. I'm a big proponent of those, of course.
Excellent.
And taking study abroad. I'm going to take a group of students to Russia next summer. So we are doing it.
I might add to that it's a good idea to get the faculty to go too.
Beyond what y'all are already doing, like, you know, promoting 20% of students studying abroad, what other role do you think academics has in expanding and helping the students in globalization? Do you feel that there will be more American universities abroad or foreign universities on our soils? For all the doctors, what do you think the academia will do to help promote globalization?
I think globalization starts at home. And the key is some of the faculty members themselves are not really, I mean, regardless of what There are some faculty members who are familiar with globalization. The vast majority of them still don't buy it. I mean, you think they know, they don't. So unless a person buys the whole concept of globalization, they're not going to pass it on to their students. You know? So it depends upon the course. If you're teaching an international course, obviously you're going to be talking about globalization, its importance. But there are many people, sad to say, many of our faculty members don't buy that. They say, well, this is a passing phase, this is a fad, perhaps. So they are, to an extent, doing a disservice to the students.
Could I offer a challenge to John? And that is that since you have some connection with, and perhaps currently some operations in Mexico, maybe you could offer some internships to students here at West Texas that might be able to go and work abroad and come back and go through culture shock and all those things and learn to go out on the ground.
Well, unfortunately, I'm no longer involved with Walmart, so the Mexico connection is historical, but we do offer interns, not only here, but in many of our stores, and find some of our best executives. In fact, our Vice President of Information Technology started as an intern at New Mexico State some 15 years ago. So it's a great way to get, the great thing about students is that they're so quick to learn, and they're just like a sponge, and the faster you throw stuff at them, the quicker they learn it. And so we fast track them, and they have a lot of fun, we have a lot of fun.
Other questions? We still have a few minutes.
Well, how do you all assess the forces that oppose globalism? What's the trend in the world today on things like, say, nationalism, politically, ideologically, backlashes against globalism? And one area that I'm particularly curious about is agricultural subsidies. It seems to be a perennial problem. What's happening there?
Well, obviously, when you look at globalization, the countries which are gaining are the emerging economies, so they are much in favor of it. The ones who are not really in favor of it are the developed economies, say some in Europe in particular, I would say, and of course here in the United States as well. And they are the ones who are being impacted, as I mentioned earlier, because of the change in the production systems, which is going to lay off people in certain fields. If you look at GM, for example, GM is going to shut down a lot of plants in the US, but going to open up plants in China and India. So who's going to gain? So the people who are getting hurt are the ones here. So it's a question of retraining and moving to other jobs. So that's why you see more backlash here, and not so much in the developed world. And agriculture has historically been a distorted sector of most economies, and the subsidies are tremendous in Europe. You have the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, which is the biggest budget item in European Union. The US, we have a problem as well. And that really distorts global trade in agriculture. So although you do still have efficient agricultural production countries in the developed countries of the world, they are not able to produce because so much of the agricultural surpluses are dumped into the international market, depressing prices at which they cannot produce. So that's why the recent failure of the Doha Accord, if you've been following that, is largely because of that. So the developing countries have said, well, enough, we're not going to go to more liberalization unless you first take care of this agricultural subsidy. And it's a big stumbling block. And as John mentioned, politicians don't want to handle the hot potato. They would like to go for the easy ones. And so you're going to have this bickering.
Well, I'm for welfare reform, and I think we need to get business off welfare. And I think probably the worst bill that was passed by Lubbock Congressman Larry Combest, who is now a lobbyist. And that was this large, we really had the American agricultural subsidies under control and declining, and then we passed this new bill that's just an enormous entitlement. Even the farmers I know think it's too much. And I don't think politically it's needed because that's not where the votes are. Now that may be where the lobbyists are, and that's where,
a lot of donations go. But politically, I don't think it's that brave to say, you know, all we have to do is move the Iowa caucus, and I think we'd have everything solved.
You remember the WTO meetings in Seattle and all the street battles and things that were going on? When I watched that, the word that came to my mind to describe those folks was a word from a long time ago, Luddites. Anyone here know what a Luddite is? Yeah. If you're not familiar with that term, you might go look it up. It describes people who have battled against these kinds of things in centuries past. Ag subsidies, I agree, are a problem. I think they will continue to be a problem. If you look at the structure of the political systems in a great many democracies around the world, you see that there's a disproportionate amount of political power that has been structurally given to agricultural interests. And it's not entirely irrational in the sense if you think about governments sort of looking at the world in terms of Maslow's hierarchy and saying, okay, what's the first thing we have to have for people to be happy here? We got to have food, right? So there's a lot of effort put in to make sure that people are well fed. And sometimes that gets in the way of other things, especially when the agricultural interests are involved in more industrial kinds of production as opposed to just simple putting meals on the table.
I have a question that Mr. Marmaduke kind of made me think about. You said that China, I guess, getting on their growth rate is just so immense because, you know, they do have lower taxes, you know, around 11%, you said. And also they're allowing much more foreign investing, less control, you know, associated with that. So that Europe was going to be declining based upon the tax rate. What do y'all think politically as far as America and Europe allowing foreign investments in here, you know, like the buy boards? What do you think, how do you think that will change and, you know, related to how prosperous China is right now? You know, them allowing foreign control and lower tax rates. Do you think the rest of the world will kind of, you know, feed off that and maybe lower their tax rates and increase foreign control? Or do you think that's just kind of like a milestone that we'll never get over?
Well, I think the whole issue of foreign investment has been hyped. The largest recipient of foreign investment, direct foreign investment, is the United States. Okay, by far, it's about $250 billion a year. Second is UK. China comes around fifth or so.